Every valley you experienced, if you go back to that valley and examine it carefully, here's what you're going to discover. At that point in your life, you were struggling with your identity. Oh, I'm a married man. Oh, I'm no longer married. Oh, I did this my whole life. I'm now fired. I thought I was a competent X, and now I discovered they don't think I'm competent. It's struggling with who you think you are. And every time you encounter a struggle, I'll guarantee you there's an identity issue at the core of it. That's why it's important to have sameness in continuity, because people who establish their identity in something continuous and unchanging don't struggle as much. In other words, if I could say, I'll tell you what, I'm going to take away those identity struggles, well, then you're probably going to have a much more stable life. If you continue to put your identity in things that change or fluctuate or can be stolen from you, you will struggle. But if you can put your identity in something that is continuous in sameness, you will not struggle as much. There's a connection between identity and trauma. And we see it with police officers all the time, because they get critically injured and they are no longer the superhero. By the way, nothing is more identity-centered than a profession that it actually asks you to put on a superhero costume every day. You will put your identity in that costume. And then when you can't do it very well anymore because you've been critically injured, you don't think you even have a reason to live, because you're no longer the superhero you thought you were. It's an identity issue. So here we are sitting in this room together, Jimmy and I, and we're looking at this guy, Lincoln Templeton, and I'm thinking to myself, why is it that night I got home and Susie was waiting for me, and I was trying to figure out, why am I struggling like Lincoln? Lincoln's not a Christian, so I get it. But I am a Christian. Yet I was struggling every bit as much as Lincoln. It turns out that identity is so critical that we've studied it now. And I've collected every study on identity you can find over the last 30 years. And here's what I'll tell you. Identity really matters. As a matter of fact, one report puts it this way: certainty about oneself and the direction one is going is closely related to better functioning in multiple domains. In other words, identity matters, and it matters even more to young people than it does to older people. One study says it this way: a stable and strong sense of identity is associated with better mental health of adolescents. So I want to just throw this out to you. If you're raising young people, or if you're even thinking about this yourself, there's only 3 ways that any of us forms identity. Okay? I want to share them with you. One is ancient, one is more modern, and one transcends both. So I'll just give you the 3 ways we form identity. The first way we form identity is what I call outside in. I'm not the only person who's probably called it this, but I'm just going to throw it to you this way. And that's where you look outside yourself for something with which you identify, and then you pull that in and make that your identity. This is a very ancient form of identity creation, right? In other words, here you are, and you say, okay, who am I really? Well, I look outside and I say, well, who's my tribe? Who's my family? What is my profession? These are things outside yourself. Oh, we're farmers. And the ancients would do this. We are farmers. We are iron workers. We are coal miners. We are Wallaces. We are from this tribe. You're looking outside yourself to either your family or your group or your profession or your nation, and you're identifying yourself based on this thing that exists outside yourself. Does that make sense? Now, here's the problem with this. Lincoln was doing this, by the way. Lincoln was doing this. He looked outside himself. He knew that the Templetons played football. And this thing out here, football players, he wanted to be one of them. He wanted to be part of that group. I was doing the same thing. On my side, I am looking, my dad, 3 generations of law enforcement, okay? That's who we are. When you hear someone say, that's just who I am, they're talking about identity. So I was doing the same thing that Lincoln was doing. And by the way, this is unstable. You know why it's unstable? Because a day comes when you're no longer that thing. Well, then who are you? Have you noticed how football players will sometimes extend their career just a little bit too long? Really? Why don't you want to retire at your peak? Because who would I be then? Why does Tom Brady play until he's 50, however old he was? Because he's having a struggle with who am I? If I'm not this. We all do it. And it's unstable because there's a time in which this can be taken from you, or there's a time in which this makes more, let's put it this way. If you're a part of a family identity, and you are growing up, and you're part of the Gambino crime mob, okay? Is this a good way to form your identity? Is a Gambino life a life well lived? How do I even know if my identity is virtuous if I'm forming it this way? Depends. There's another way we form identity. This way is much more modern, but I think most of us do both of these things. I certainly do both of these things. I call this inside-out identity formation. Here's what you do. You look inside your heart at the things you love, the things you desire, the things that are native to you, and you find your identity inwardly, and you just proclaim it to the world. So you're looking inside your own heart. So for example, whatever your skills are, if you're a good artist, that's just who you are. You start to form your identity this way. So often you'll place your identity in your kind of like your native skill set or your sexual desires, what you're good at, things that are personal to you. And we see young people all the time who are doing this now. They're identifying themselves based on how they see themselves, regardless of what's around them. And that's why you'll see these mantras, even in the church, right? Be yourself, live your truth, just be you, follow your heart. When you hear these kinds of words, these are people who are forming their identity from the inside out. Now, here's the problem with this. You can probably see it coming. Your heart is fickle. And in the course of your life, trust me, I'm now 62, you will change your desires over and over and over again. There's stuff now that for example, Dr. Susie, I'm starting to eat the food that she eats. What the heck is going on with that? She eats food I hate, but no, I'm eating it now. Why? I kind of like it. What's going on there? Your desires change because your heart is fickle. So this is an unstable life because you'll change your desires over the course of your life several times. And if you're basing your life on what you think you're good at, your gifting, well, then you'll always find somebody who's better gifted than you. And it starts to affect your identity. So for example, when I was growing up, I was a guitar player. And so I would build guitars and I would play guitar. And I would, every time I went to any garage band, I was always the best lead guitarist in that room. I would listen note for note to Carlos Santana or Neil Schon from Journey, and I would just memorize the licks and learn and try to, and I remember this album. Any old people remember who Peter Frampton was? No one? Okay, a few people, thank you. He had this double album set, and I remember I learned this thing note for note. I could play every song on this note for note. I loved this double album set. A lot of guitar players came up listening to that album. And so I identified myself as a guitar player until this jerk named Eddie Van Halen popped on the scene. And then suddenly we're like going, what in the world is he doing? We didn't have videos back then. All we had was the recordings, LPs. I put the thing down on Eddie Van Halen. He's like using more fingers than I have. I told Susie, I'm done. I haven't played the guitar really since. This dude killed me because my identity was to be the best. If I couldn't be the best at it, I don't even want to try. Well, clearly, Eddie Van Halen's the best, so you put your identity this way, get ready. Somebody's going to steal it from you. There'll always be a better version of you out there. That's the problem with this. And by the way, have you known psychopaths and sociopaths who just chased their desires and found meaning in their desires? Do you think that these knuckleheads who are all dead or in jail, you think these folks, they chase their desires? That doesn't provide a virtuous life. A serial killer, is he living a good life just because he's living the life he thinks he was meant to live? Not necessarily. Again, this does not guarantee virtue. So there's a third way. This is by far the more stable way of forming your identity. And this is topside down identity. This is when you look up to grab something with which you identify. You bring it home from the top down. You're looking to your Creator, and you're listening to what He has to say about you. Now, why is this stable? Because He doesn't change. So if you're looking for a continuous identity formation, this is the way to do it. If I put my identity as an author and I say, well, I sold 1 million books, okay, well, there's always somebody who sold more books than you have. If I said, oh, I've got 5-star reviews, well, there's always somebody who's got more 5-star reviews than you have. If I say, oh, yeah, I'm an author who's got this or that, well, there's always somebody online who says you're a jerk, who's a terrible author, and your work sucks. You can't put your identity in those things. This doesn't change, though. If there is a transcendent, unchanging God, then He becomes the source of all the stuff that happens to you. If your identity is grounded in this nature of this moral God, you also know you are sitting in virtue. In other words, unlike the people who put their identity in the Gambino crime family or in their murderous desires, if you put your identity in God, you're far more likely to live a godly life. Because you can put your identity in those other things and not live a godly life. But if you put your identity in God, you are far more likely to live the godly life. So it turns out there's virtue that comes out of this. So the 3 ways you can form identity are here: outside in, inside out, and topside down. And of these 3 ways, 2 are unstable, and 1 is very stable. So I tell young people all the time, if you want to protect yourself from trauma, here's how you do it.